Hi, this episode is being recorded in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's going to cover how communication can go even more terribly wrong with the addition of PPE, personal protective equipment like masks and face shields, and then cover some of the things that we can do to help mitigate those factors and try to have the most effective communication that we can while encumbered by these necessary protective items. So first, let's be honest with ourselves. Communication, even without the encumbrances of PPE in normal circumstances, goes horribly wrong all the time. People misunderstand each other, words have double meanings, people will say things but actually mean something else. Communication ultimately is not the message necessarily that's being sent out, it's the message that is received by the listener. And there are so many different things that can interfere in that process we all know just how badly wrong it can go. So let's just use that as our starting base before we start to pile on some of the other issues that are specific to wearing facial coverings. Now, in communications, you'll often hear some percentages thrown around that talk about how much of a given message is down to the actual words and how much is down to other things such as body language and tonality. This is coming from the Morabian studies back in 1967 at UCLA. They've been widely misrepresented and misquoted. Even the key author says that if you check out what he's got on his website. So let's just cover what was going on and what these numbers mean. So what you might have heard is that 55% of all communication is body language, 38% is down to tone, and another 7% is down to the words chosen. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because we have to appreciate that there's a mix of things happening here. There is language, there is tonality, there is body posture, body language, gestures, and so on that all put together to make the package of communication. But is words really only just 7% of the story? Well, no, it isn't. It's one of the biggest myths in communication, and I'm not going to go through it here because we don't have the time or the capacity. Maybe that's for another episode. But basically, in these studies, they were more or less looking at situations where it's emotions that are being communicated, particularly where the emotions contradict what's happening with the rest of the body language. So, for example, if someone said, "No, I'm not angry," then generally what's happening is the listener is disregarding the words because everything else creates such an overwhelming message to the contrary. If you're forced to make a choice between the two, you're going to disregard the words and go with the other. So again, not to get too deep into that, but don't get hooked in by the it's only 7% words, because it's not. And just let's agree that there are many factors and they're all going to be important, and we're going to cover those one by one as we go through this later on. I'm going to simulate the impact of putting on PPE so you can see for yourself what you're dealing with if you haven't done this already. So first off, here's me in a mask. Now, apart from affecting the exposure settings on the camera because I've got something white on my face now, obviously it muffles the voice somewhat and my facial expressions are really diminished. If I'm attempting to give you something along the lines of anger, concern, surprise, fear, you'll still pick up something of the message, but a big part of what's going on is here, and that's just no longer available to us. Now let's add a face shield. This makes the volume and the clarity of the voice even worse because I've got echoes, and then all the reflections all over the front here. Yes, you can still see my eyes, but the forehead is largely covered. I've got glasses on, you've got reflections going on both the glasses and the shield combined. That means that it's pretty hard to read my face. You've really just got the words to go by to a large extent. Now let's add distance. So normally, okay, you're seeing this, but if we're adding in some 2 meters or thereabouts social distance, then the perception of the size of my head and face is going to be about something the size of this fella here. So we've seen how compromised the facial expressions can really be when you put in all of those factors. Nevertheless, they are still there. They're useful. You may find that you need to almost consciously exaggerate your facial expressions if you're wanting to help support the message that you're wanting to get across. Looking at the speech element, it's really useful to keep in mind an old adage from the sales profession, which is kiss versus kill. Kiss, K-I-S-S, keep it short and simple, versus kill, keep it long and longer. Why? Because keeping it long and longer kills deals. It doesn't work. So if we're going to be in these compromised situations in terms of communication, it really behooves us to use simple, concise, clear speech. If you're someone who tends to use, long sentences that run to paragraphs, chop them up. Eliminate words that are not necessary. Leave pauses between words if you need to. It's much better to have some dead air space in between words than to fill it with an ah, or some other type of filler word. It just is going to give the listener a little bit better chance to process what you're saying without adding anything extra necessary on top of what you're doing. Choose the words carefully. Some words do have two meanings. Some words, just are going to be jargon that might not be picked up by the person that you're communicating with. So if you're going to be rehearsing a conversation ahead of time, think about what your key messages are going to be. Lay it out. Plan how you can really briefly communicate that in a nice, sharp, clear way that's going to make it easier for the other party to get across what you're trying to say. On tonality, it might be important to highlight tonality more than you would do in normal circumstances. Some people, if you look at the pattern of their voice, it's quite steady. Others have sharp rises and drops and so on. You may find that if your speech is a little bit more of the steady state, to help get your message across, you need to infuse it. You need to infuse it with some almost theatrical tonality in certain key places. Obviously, this is not a stage theater performance. You don't want to go over the top and bamboozle your listener. But this is definitely the time where you can augment what you're saying by adding that extra emphasis through the tonality that you're using in the words, and keywords at that. So body language is still going to be entirely valid. What you may find that you need to do is just be more aware of that, like tonality, and exaggerate it where and when you need to. Hand signals, similar. We can look at some of the universal hand signals that, undersea divers use, people in different walks of life will use, just when it's, not so straightforward to communicate with words, or it's impossible to communicate with words. So, the simple thumbs up, thumbs down, I don't know, stop. These are all things that you can definitely add in as, an actual communication device that does not need a word accompanying it. On top of that, you can also use gestures to supplement what you're saying. For example, on the one hand, on the other hand, we have options like this, this, and this. We hope we can reach an agreement on this. Thank you very much. These are all little gestures that you can add in, again, sparingly. This is not a pantomime show, but you can add those in where appropriate to the speech to make sure that you help get your message across, because the listener is going to need every little bit of help that you can give them. And just a final note, I was really only in the PPE for a few moments while I was putting together this video. It was hot. It was uncomfortable. I cannot even begin to imagine what it is like for many of the very brave and hardworking people who are, in our medical services and our caring services, first responders, and all these walks of life that are keeping things going for the rest of us. I'm talking about a business context here. It is nothing like the stakes that these people are dealing with on a daily basis. It is nothing by comparison whatsoever. So please have a thought for them and be grateful for what they're doing for us, because they're putting up with this in a massive way that we can't even begin to contemplate.